there. So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today on our discussion on a new report that's coming out from the Fuels Institute via Strata. And it is the assessment of biofuels policy, where we looked at the effectiveness of emissions reductions through certain policies, whether they were regional, state, federal policies, and looking forward to sharing the report and a couple of housekeeping things. While we're giving the report, if it's kind of hard to see the screen, you can go up to the 3 ellipses up there, up on the top of the page, and you can actually click on that and click on focus on content. Something new this old man just was taught the other day, so that'll just blow up the screen for you so you can see that. If you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A section, and I'm going to be taking a look at those as those roll in, and we'll try to combine them and get everyone's questions answered. And then also you can use the chat function as well, and we'll keep an eye on that. So a pretty important topic today. It looks like we've got a really good group of folks. So again, thanks for joining us. We've got a number of things going on that I know we're all keeping a close eye on. We have the consent decree with EPA that is asking that EPA have the set provisions of the RFS drafted and ready for a comment period by, I believe it's September 16th. So that's going to be right around the corner. So as we talk about biofuels and how we're looking at post 2022, those rules are going to be ultimately important and what's going to drive us federally over the next several years. And of course, the Fuels Institute is also looking at other state and regional programs, whether they are zero emission policies or biofuels, low carbon fuel policies. So we are constantly working in those areas as well. So again, if you've got any questions, drop them in the Q&A, and I'm going to go behind the scenes here, and I'm going to hand it over to John. Well, I tell you what, John, Amanda, can you forward the next slide here? And I wanted to give a little more background for those that aren't familiar with the Fuels Institute. Something that's really important, I think, that we discuss on all of our workshops and our presentations is who is the Fuels Institute. So if you're new to the group, understand that the Fuels Institute is a non-advocacy group. We bring together these industries that are in front of you right now that make up our board of advisors, plus many others that add content to our research. So we do not advocate. The folks that come to the table have one interest in mind, really, and that is, how do we move forward under the current environment, policy environment, to make sure that businesses can continue to grow under umbrellas of reduced emissions. Has been taking up a lot of our time lately for the past couple of years. So obviously it's a big driving factor. But this is our board of advisors. And if you have interest in joining the Fuels Institute and taking part in some of the research that we're doing, these are the folks that bring up the hurdles that are in front of us, and they help us navigate through different pieces of research so that we can find those answers and get to those solutions, again, in a very unbiased manner, about as unbiased as you could possibly get out there. So it's a great group. I've been with the Fuels Institute now for just over a couple of years, and it is fantastic. It's an excellent environment to work in. So I didn't come on here to make a sales pitch for the Fuels Institute, but if you're not involved, please pick up the phone after this event and give John Eichberger or myself a shout. So, okay, that definitely did sound like a pitch. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to John Eichberger.
Sometimes you just pull a string on your back and you just go. So it's all good. One of the reasons we show this slide is just to demonstrate the diversity of our board. We've been working really hard to kind of expand the diversity to make sure that we have different perspectives. And when you think about doing unbiased research, there's really no such thing as anybody without bias. But when you have a group that is as across the spectrum as our board, and they have the ability to peer review and vote to approve publication. You pretty confident coming out with a fairly objective piece of work. So next slide, Amanda. Before I turn it over to Austin, I just kind of want to get some background as to why did the Fuels Institute decide to do this? And there's a variety of reasons. But the primary one is, next slide, the discussion about moving forward to decarbonize transportation coming from a lot of sectors. And you see here, your customers are asking for it, investors with ESG, heavy impact on the market to push for decarbonization. There's some regulation, society, employees, banks. I mean, the pressures to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector is intense. And we can't take that for granted. We have to recognize that that's a reality. Whether we like it or not, it's really irrelevant. That's where we are, that's where we're heading. And so at the Fuels Institute, what we've been tasked to do by our board is to really pursue options and evaluate how we decarbonize in the most effective, efficient way. Next slide. There are a lot of people thinking that the decarbonization path is all electric. And that's just wrong. It cannot be. The electric vehicles are going to be a critical component of the transportation space, and they're an important element to decarbonizing the sector, but they're not going to solve everything, and they're not going to be the right answer for all applications, all use cases. And as the next slide shows here, one of the biggest thing is if we are seriously facing a crisis, an environmental crisis, waiting for new technology to replace 300 million vehicles in the United States or 1.4 billion vehicles in the world is a failed strategy. I did an analysis a couple years ago. Bloomberg said by 2040, they predicted 60% of sales would be plug-in electric. If that were the case on a linear growth rate, that only converts 27% of the vehicles on the road. So under that scenario, 3/4 of the vehicles on the road would still be combustion. A new paper coming out for us, IHS Markit now, S&P Global Mobility, their forecast is 18 million electric vehicles by 2030, which is only 6% of the fleet by 2030. So we're looking at a scenario where we're going to have hundreds of millions of combustion engine vehicles in the United States for decades. And if we really want to be serious about reducing carbon emissions from transportation, we can't ignore those. Next slide. So what do we do with the 300 million vehicles that are on the road? And that's kind of what led us to this study here. Next slide. We did a paper that we published in January looking at life cycle emissions of electric, hybrid, and internal combustion engine vehicles. And I show this slide just to point out that if we want to reduce carbon emissions from the combustion engine vehicle fleet, we have to focus on the operating cycle. And that's 73% of all GHG emissions come from that cycle where we're actually consuming liquid fuels. And so if we're going to make an improvement in the existing fleet and in the millions of vehicles that are going to be coming to market with combustion engines over the next 10 to 20, 30 years, then we have to focus on not only vehicle efficiency, but the carbon intensity of that liquid fuel. Next slide. And so that's really the basis of doing the study. We wanted to find out, biofuels right now, we believe represent probably the best option in the near term to reduce carbon. And we really want to understand, okay, to what extent can they yield a lower carbon intensive fuel? To what extent can we scale? Can we enhance the utilization of them in the market to deliver meaningful carbon reductions in the current fleet and in the emerging combustion engine vehicle fleet? So we turned to Stratus Advisors. We worked with Stratus several times in the past. Love the work they do. They do a fantastic job. So we asked them to kind of start off with do a comprehensive literature review. This wasn't an in-depth new data formulation, new laboratory study. This is looking at the prevailing literature to find out, okay, what do we know? What is the art of the current state of affairs? What is the potential direction the market could go? What are the policies that are supporting the market or possibly standing in the way of progress so that we can have a more informed discussion about how we more effectively and efficiently leverage these products in the existing liquid fuels market to deliver meaningful carbon reductions in the transportation sector. And with that, I'll turn it over to Austin with Stratus Advisors to kind of walk through some of the findings of the study. And then when he's done, we'll open up to a conversation with Jeff and any questions you guys have. So Austin, it's all yours.
Thanks, John. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak today and also for our team to work on this study. And as John just mentioned, the report targets all emissions in the transportation sector, and it goes into more detail on hydrogen, synthetic fuels, really looking at all the options. But we are focused on today and near-term emissions reduction. So the focus of today's presentation is a lot of the highlights from the report. So it's mainly on biofuels here. And if you go to the first slide, well, yeah, but beyond the disclaimers. Yeah, this is just setting up some of the framework here of an introduction. And one of the main points of the paper is really highlighting the lack of a universally accepted carbon intensity accounting standard. And the graph here on the right is just an example highlighting two big biofuel renewable fuel markets, California and Germany, and the difference between the carbon intensities here. That's mainly down to indirect land use change, in that Germany does not account for that. Also, British Columbia and Canada does not account for indirect land use change. So there's a big disconnect between international markets, but even in the domestic market, there's a couple different programs you can use to calculate carbon intensities. There's a bit of overlap now with California and Oregon, where in the Oregon market, you can use your California carbon intensity and then add a premium to account for the transportation to Oregon. But still, we haven't seen a lot of conjecture around this point. And for the purpose of this paper, for our emissions reductions calculations, we averaged California's 2019 average carbon intensities for each fuel pathway, and the DOE's Argonne, which gave us a value for ethanol of about 53.3 grams of CO2 equivalent emissions per megajoule, and for biodiesel about 32.7, and renewable diesel about 34.7. And as mentioned before, the EV fleet build out is expected to take time, depending on the different scenarios and charging infrastructure build out. So when you look at biofuels, and I know most people on this call know most of this information again, but to highlight, ethanol is typically blended in E10 blends, which is typically just under 10% ethanol by volume. And then there's also a potential for E15, which is up to 15% ethanol by volume. And that's the main potential here for ethanol's expansion. Flex fuel vehicle fleet penetration has slowed down, and so higher blends of ethanol have been harder to deploy. Biodiesel is typically blended up to 5%, and in some cases up to 20%. And renewable diesel, which has been the biggest hot topic of biofuels for the past couple of years, which is a fungible drop-in fuel in the diesel fleet, has now grown to about over 35% of California's diesel pool in the latest 2022 Q1 data report. And just in 2019 in the report, this figure was closer to 15%, 16%. So it's seeing a rapid expansion. And if you go to the next slide, you could talk about a bit why. So the main driver of renewable diesel's expansion is California's LCFS program, and also some of the other West Coast LCFS programs. And again, in Europe, there's other programs as well. And they basically incentivize renewable diesel use since it's the variable source of compliance. And that's mainly because the gasoline pool, as discussed, is a bit harder to decarbonize currently with the track that electrification is undergoing, and the regulatory and other factors limiting ethanol blending beyond its current market share of just over 10%. So when you have that on the gasoline side, in order to ensure compliance in the program, you need an over-compliance in the diesel pool. And with the limitations on biodiesel blending, renewable diesel has mainly been the answer. So we're seeing a massive ramp up in renewable diesel production and blending in California, and this is expected to continue. And we've highlighted here, renewable diesel capacity of about 900 million gallons in 2021, which is, over 1 billion now in 2022, and is expected to reach over 5 billion in 2025, which is a rapid expansion. And that's going to breed a bunch of competition for feedstocks. We've seen that already with biodiesel, since biodiesel and renewable diesel use largely the same feedstocks. There's been some cannibalization of biodiesel's market share, and also in biodiesel production facilities, with some of them being converted into feedstock processing centers for nearby renewable diesel plants. And these two pathways provided about 23 million metric tons of emissions reduction in 2019, given those carbon intensities I mentioned earlier. And to touch on the feedstock competition, once again, we believe this is a huge issue facing our the biofuels industry over the next couple of years, as we see this massive ramp up in feedstock demand. Because you see in the graph here, this is projected U.S. feedstock production, and if you were to overlay the feedstock that would go to renewable diesel, it would basically eat up about all of this graph, and that's not accounting for biodiesel or sustainable aviation fuel, which would largely overlap with RD, but it would breed some more competition. And then also other industrial users of these oil seeds and animal fats and used cooking oil. So food processors mainly and animal feed producers are also competing for these feedstocks, which is going to drive up prices and likely a lot of pressure. And a lot of people are going to start asking questions. I mean, we've already seen in this year with the crazy things happening in the global oilseeds market, there's already been a lot of price pressures, and this current is likely to continue given the current direction of policies and the market. If you go to the next slide, on the ethanol side, there's relatively less potential for feedstock competition. U.S. is a massive producer of corn, and as mentioned before, there hasn't been a large increase in ethanol blending yet. But for some facts from the report, ethanol accounted for about 75 million metric tons of CO2 emissions reductions in 2019. And if in 2020, from January 1st to the end of the year, if all E10 were replaced with E15, that would be about 111 million metric tons in 2022 of emissions reduction. We've seen this year the Biden administration introduce an emergency E15 waiver. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if there's ever a move to make that more permanent, or just a continuation of granting an emergency waiver, or if the market reacts to that and builds out some more E15 infrastructure. Because currently only about 1.7% of US retail stations offer E15, which equates to a market share of only about 2.5%. And as mentioned with the CI for ethanol, that represents about a 45% lower emissions than gasoline currently. And an interesting development here in the ethanol industry is the industry's target of net zero ethanol by 2050, which would make it competitive with a lot of other discussed alternative fuels in the future. And the main two ways that ethanol could reach this is through carbon capture, which would be supported through a tax credit of 45Q, and then also sustainable farming, which LCFS programs are incentivizing by recently California allowing individual farms to have their carbon intensity scores audited and have their corn certified as low CI corn, depending on their sustainable farming practices, including using lower nitrogen fertilizer and no-till and some other sustainable farming practices that the report mentions. If we go to the next slide here. So checking out some of the current legislative environment, again, the report goes into more detail about all these programs, but just highlighting some of the more topical and new developments here. So on the RFS federal level, corn ethanol is currently in the D6 RIN bucket, and regardless of its carbon intensity, it'll always be D6 RIN currently. So that's interesting if the EPA or Congress now would revisit this in the future if a lot of these carbon capture programs were successful and sustainable farming practices take off, and we get to a point where ethanol has a really low CI, if it would be adjusted there under the RFS. And some recent news, of course, the D6 price was recently boosted by RVO increases. Part of that was through application of court decision, but the effect was about 320 million gallons of the 2021 D6 RVO increase, and in 2022 about 110 million gallons. On the LCFS and state level side, California is likely to raise its 2030 GHG reduction target to either 25% or 30%, up from its current level of 20%. And this is mainly due to the rapid drop in credit prices from about $200 in 2019 to below $100. And this week they've been even below $90 per net metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And not to get too deep into California's LCFS on this call, but they mainly see themselves as a leader in the renewable fuel space and driving a lot of the investment in new technologies and production facilities. So they'd like to have a higher credit price in order to keep incentivizing new fuels. And then a main highlight from the report here. So the three main programs from the government that are fueling biofuel use in the U.S., the RFS, the Blender's Tax Credit, and the LCFS programs cost about $22.6 billion in 2019 for savings of about 98 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or about $231 per million metric ton. And on the carbon capture side, which hasn't played a role yet in emissions in the biofuel space, this is through the tax code 45Q, which is currently about $32 per metric ton, rising to $50 per metric ton in 2026. And then thereafter, a peg to inflation. About 2/3 of current U.S. ethanol capacity has announced plans to implement carbon capture. And that would have lower emissions by about 32 million metric tons, or a huge deal, basically. And on the carbon intensity side, a conservative estimate, of course, depending on your accounting for carbon intensity, a conservative estimate would be a saving of about 15 grams of CO2 per megajoule. A more typical range, we think, would be between 20 and 30, and the reports that we've read say. So splitting the difference there would be about 25 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And on the next slide, we're going a bit beyond what the report covered here, but as we all know, the industry changes very quickly. So I wanted to keep this presentation topical and touch on a few upcoming regulatory developments that have happened since the report's been published even. But this week, the Senate is supposed to vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which, of course, has more to do with climate and renewable fuels and renewable energy than it does inflation. But that's our Congress. So carbon capture 45Q credit is supposed to be extended under the program. So it would have its value raised from $50 per metric ton in 2026 to $85 per metric ton in 2026 for industrial uses. Enhanced oil recovery of fracking has a lower value under 45Q. And then also the qualifying date for the tax credit would be extended to 2023, or your carbon capture project has to be under construction before January 1st, 2033. And as mentioned before, 2/3 of current ethanol capacity has announced plans for carbon capture, and an increase in the tax credit here would really help ensure that a lot of those projects are economical and break even. And then we could even see an expansion. Of course, it would be virtually impossible to get to 100% of ethanol, of the ethanol industry undergoing carbon capture, depending on the individual plant size and economics, and their mainly their geography, since a lot of these plants are going to be joining onto a few pipelines, basically. So, your geographic location relative to these other projects, which would be a huge development as well for the ethanol industry. Some other developments in the act here, the blender's tax credit, which provides biodiesel producers and renewable diesel producers with $1 per gallon tax credit, which expires in 2023. That would be extended to 2025. And then also interestingly here, SAF, which is Sustainable Aviation Fuels, currently do not receive any tax credit, but are eligible for RIN production and also credit generation under the LCFS. They would be receiving, in effect, a blender's tax credit of $1.25 up to $1.75 per gallon, depending on the GHG reductions or carbon intensity of that SAF. And not to get too deep in SAF either, since this report focused on road transportation, but in the next decade, most of SAF, especially in the U.S., is expected to come from HEFA, which comes from renewable diesel production facilities as a co-product and can be scaled up depending on the configuration of the plant and feedstocks. So that's also going to likely increase a bit of competition for these feedstocks until SAF moves into the direction of some other technology pathways, which are a long ways out. Under the RFS here, we're entering a post-2022 RFS, which effectively won't change that much, really, with the EPA taking over, setting the mandates, which they basically have been doing. But it's interesting that, Congress may look to revisit the RFS. There's been talks of a national LCFS program or something, another piece of legislation that would overhaul the RFS. In this fall session, we're looking to see if there's any release about any information about a potential introduction of e-RINs, which would be RINs generated for EV charging, whether, they start releasing how they're going to regulate that and whether that would be in 2023 or 2024, and how that'll affect mainly the D3 RVO numbers. Also, again, as mentioned before, the E15 emergency waiver, whether that would be tackled in a more permanent way or and if that would be included in an expanded D6 RVO. And lastly here, our friends to the north across the border are launching their clean fuel standard in 2023. And this is expected to have an impact because these credits can be combined with British Columbia's LCFS credit, which recently shot up mainly in 2021 to about $325 per metric ton, which is higher than any other West Coast LCFS credit. That's mainly to attract renewable diesel imports, as mentioned before, which are the variable source of compliance. BC relies on renewable diesel imports to balance their program. And, in contrast to some of the other programs which have seen huge credit builds, BC's program is a lot tighter of a market. So they need to incentivize imports from the US and Singapore there. And that basically wraps up the main points today. But I look forward to answering any questions anyone has, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks, Austin. And man, if we can get one more slide here. There's a lot of information here that Austin went through, and you can dive into the study pretty carefully if you want to. But when I look at it, I come up with a few takeaways. Again, these are me, not from the report itself, but if we assume corn-based ethanol is about 45% less carbon intense than gasoline, which I think what Austin said, how low can it go with carbon capture? If we can get to net zero, that's fantastic. And we should be pursuing that. So that's always an opportunity there to be explored. Bio and renewable diesel already significantly lower carbon intense than their comparative diesel. So we've got low carbon options. And the question is, how do we get them to market? And Austin mentioned current blend levels and utilization are limited. And there's a variety of reasons: equipment compatibility standards, vehicle warranties, production capacity, feedstock constraints, competition for feedstocks. All those things tie in together. And how we overcome those hurdles to capitalize on the low carbon intensity of these biofuels is a critical element that needs to be examined. There's been a variety of policies that he mentioned in the papers laid out how they've been implemented, what impact they've had on the market. But there's opportunities with the set rule, potentially Congress doing something next Congress. I know there's a Next Generation Fuels Act. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there floating around. The problem I find, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people, is in an environment where you have leaders thinking that electric vehicles are the answer, they're not interested in talking about fuels, and we need to break that. Not taking anything away from the value of an electric vehicle, but we've got to have a conversation about how we capitalize on our fuels options, because these internal combustion engine vehicles aren't going away anytime soon, and we need to be diligent in how we take care of them and how we approach their emissions profile. And the bottom question I have here is really for all of us to kind of contemplate is how can the sector collaborate to capitalize on biofuels and bring them to market to benefit the combustion engine vehicles. So there's two major challenges. Break the cycle of it's all electric all the time and get the leaders to talk about a variety of options, and then get everybody within the fuel space to work together to see if we can't find paths forward, break the log jam of where we are, and open up the door to greater possibilities. So we're hopeful that this paper will get people talking a little bit more constructively and get the conversation rolling and give us some momentum to kind of open up that door of conversation again and start making some progress on identifying solutions to lower the carbon intensity of the liquid fuels market so we can benefit the environment overall in an efficient and effective way. Next slide. And with that, Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions that may have come in or questions you have.
Great presentation. Thank you very much, Austin. That was a lot of information, and I think we're on the verge of just tremendous policy change. One question that I have is that we have a number of policy issues. To John's point, this electric centric, silver bullet concept for policymakers. It's easy for them to talk about. It's easy for them to put it out there, but it really disregards the reality of the U.S. fleet. And then, of course, we know, as the Fuels Institute is doing, we're breaking that down between light duty vehicles and medium and heavy duty vehicles because they're completely different operation cycles and what have you. So it seems to me that we once we get over that hurdle and we're able to open up this discussion again, which I think a lot of us in industry and the national labs and then even the DOE and DOT, they all understand that we have to have these conversations. It's not just this near-term discussion. We have different milestones that we have to hit on emissions, and policies seem to be based upon election cycles. And how do we formulate a program that gets beyond those election cycles and looks at, okay, some of the milestones we need to hit have to be based upon breakthroughs in technology such as electrolyzers, cost of electrolyzers, or carbon capture combined with renewable electricity for e-fuels and things of that nature. So is that just the environment we're stuck with U.S. policy, that we can't look beyond the election cycle? How do we form something that goes beyond that, that's looking at the next decade even?
Who are you looking to answer that one?
I'm interested in both of your. I mean, I'll ask. So, John, you've been in this space a long time. You've been doing high octane, fuels. You've had all these other. You've seen the process. Good idea. Next election cycle comes, and that idea is out the window. And it's probably just a completely unfair question because I don't know that there is an answer.
Well, I mean, the process is broken, and that's the problem. And you're seeing a competition here between the executive branch and legislative branch. Legislative branch has a tough time, setting a schedule, let alone moving legislation. They're always focused on the next election. They're always focused on protecting or gaining seats. And so the philosophical divide is strong up there. And in the absence of congressional action, you've seen the administration try to do a couple of things. Take E15, for example. President Trump waived the RVP limitation on summertime E15 sales in 2019, and the appeals court struck it down. So they said only Congress can do that because it's a statutorily provided provision. So the Biden administration is now doing a series of these 20-day emergency waivers to try to open up the door. The market needs certainty. The market needs clarity as to what the rules of the game are if they're going to expand the market. Will Congress take action to resolve that debate? And the technological debate against it's ludicrous. E15 has a lower RVP than E10, so there should be no limitation other than it's written in the statute the way it is. But you have a situation where the executive branch is trying, both parties, both presidents, have tried to move the ball forward, and the courts came in and said Congress didn't give you that authority. And so we need Congress to step up and consider a fuels policy, not just on E15, but not just the RFS, maybe an LCFS, who knows what it is, but consider a liquid fuels combustion engine approach, not a ban, not an all EV. It's got to be a thoughtful process. And, I got out of the political game a long time ago. Probably the only reason I'm still alive, because it eats you up and spits you out. I don't know that we have the will in our legislative process to have those difficult discussions and have those constructive deliberations without political motivations getting in the way, and that's sad. But I really think that's what it comes down to. And the best time to do it is right after an election. You come back to the election, you come in, and instead of fighting over committees counts and organizational structures and spending 4 or 5 months trying to organize the Congress, come and spend that first 6 months and get some real work done. And then you spend the next year and a half on politics. But that may be Pollyannish of me to think that might be possible. So that's my political commentary. I'm sorry, it's sort of cynical, but you know what? That's what happens when you're a recovering lobbyist.
That's perfect. That's almost the answer I was expecting. So I've got another question for Austin. Austin, you were given this task of putting a dollar amount cost of carbon on via policy. So looking at CO2 reductions and what the cost of those policies were, and to basically look at what did it cost to remove so many metric tons of CO2. And I say it's a difficult task because in the fuels realm, like you pointed out, we've got the biodiesel blenders tax credit, we got the RFS RIN credit, we got LCFS. We got the potential of multiple credits there. If you could break that out in your head right now and talk about which policies in your mind were most effective on a per dollar per metric ton CO2 avoidance in this report. And I know if you haven't read the report yet, a lot of these details are in the report, so I would urge you to download that and take a look at it. But Austin, off the top of your head, which ones really jump out at you as far as being impactful?
Yeah, I mean, I believe the report goes into it a bit of, it is very difficult to separate these programs and assign, this gallon of diesel is because of the BTC versus RFS versus LCFS. So there's a lot of overlap, which makes it hard to dissect them. But off the top of my head, of course, when you look at California's LCFS and the massive drop in credit price is very upsetting to a lot of people, of course, that have invested and need a credit price. But in one aspect, it's forcing them to move forward their goals because it's been so successful, and kind of showing that you can drive a price lower. Of course, you have to caveat, the $90 per metric ton with, it's being supported by RINs, it's being supported by BTC as well. But I think if you look at the amount of investment it's attracted, and that the fact that it's ahead of schedule, that is huge right there. also, if you're just talking about tons of carbon out of the air, then of course carbon capture 45Q, with huge question mark of that. We haven't seen many, if any, successful carbon capture programs yet, but that has a large potential of reducing emissions as well, I would say.
And that carbon capture model really kind of goes into that more that long-term, midterm, long-term, because then the question is, what do you do with the carbon once you capture it? Are we gonna deep well inject it? Are we actually going to use it for e-fuels or some other type of process? And then of course that has to be in conjunction with renewable electricity. But so there's just so many different questions that could come out of that. But okay, when we're looking at the cost of carbon and the different policies, what direction does the RFS have to go? We're coming up on the set provisions for the proposed rules. To me, it sounds like it's going to be the RFS 3. It's going to be, nothing's really going to change, other than we're going to be looking at bio-intermediate pathways and a couple of other pathways, probably ERIN pathways and some other things there. And you mentioned that D6 pathway. Ethanol is stuck in this D6 pathway. It could achieve 60% emissions reduction compared to a gallon of gasoline. It's still a D6 RIN. It's not going to be anything other than D6 because of how the RFS legislation is written. Is my understanding correct that would take an act of Congress to basically come in and revise EPACT and
I
that
mean,
legislation?
yeah, I mean, with the post 2022 RFS, the EPA takes over mandating, the volumes, but a larger change to the statutes would probably have to come from Congress. The EPA could attempt it, but of course we've seen the Supreme Court get involved in, SREs and a lot of things around biofuels as well. So, the three systems of government here all come into play. But yeah, I think Congress would be the best place, which of course is not the answer the ethanol industry probably wants to hear, given how difficult it's been to have national consensus on biofuels.
Hey, Austin, you guys do a lot of analysis on a regular basis, but beyond this study, with the Supreme Court's ruling on the emissions activity at EPA last month, have you guys done any type of postmortem as to what that might mean for some of these fuels programs? Is there a shadow being cast from that decision that could limit EPA's ability to implement some of these programs that we've been talking about?
So I think most people were, you could say, fearful before the decision, and then the immediate shock of the decision led people, to scream a little bit. But I think from what I've read and heard, it was kind of a narrow decision in its striking down of the EPA there. So we don't expect it to affect the other programs like the RFS or some of these other renewable fuel programs. The ruling was very specific, I believe, to the power gen sector. Yeah.
And then of course the fallout, the fear that you're talking about too is the what if that is a precedent that's used against programs like the renewable fuel standards, even SEC's ESG rulemaking, because what's the play there over all federal agencies? So that's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even with the SEC's ESG ruling, or that hasn't even come out yet, and you've already seen investors, companies, the market already respond to it before it's even come out. So I think that undercurrent, like that earlier slide that John had with the clouds there, a lot of the undercurrents pushing for decarbonization, and the market's really becoming more aware of carbon intensity, and not just, like you mentioned before, not just volumes and percentages of renewable fuels, but what's the carbon intensity of my operations and my fuels. So, that undercurrent of pushing for ESG and, the market becoming more aware of these issues, I think is, unstoppable.
I think
I don't remember if this is in the report. I don't think it is, but in your slides, you kind of modeled out what the carbon benefit would be if we transition from E10 to E15, just on a volumetric basis. Clearly, we're looking at some regulatory hurdles to make that happen and market acceptance, so that may not happen. But Jeff and I were talking about a week or so ago, and we always go to the end fuel, but you keep talking about carbon capture upstream and lowering the CI overall. Have you guys modeled, if we were to lower the CI of the fuels we're using, say by 50%, and still use them the same volume, how big of an impact would that have on life cycle carbon of the fuel supply? So we talked about increasing volume, that we got hurdles in that. We don't really have hurdles in the technology to reduce carbon further upstream and a life cycle basis of the CI. Have you done any modeling to see what our potential might be in that respect?
Yeah, on the carbon capture slide, we have, basically the 2/3 of the ethanol industry. I don't have it right in front of me, but I believe the number is 23, I want to say, or 33 million metric tons of carbon, given that step of the well to wheels of ethanol's carbon intensity there. So carbon capture, of course, takes out that carbon intensity of that step and puts it in the ground for storage in perpetuity, we hope. And the other factor there, which the ethanol industry has already been doing, is changing the process energy, so switching natural gas or coal or grid electricity to renewables or biomass. Yeah.
Jeff, a lot of people say it's not enough, but every little bit helps. And I think one of the premises of us going into the study was abating a ton of carbon emitted today is a good thing, because it's going to hang around for a very long time in the atmosphere. And so those who will say that, I just did a calculation, if it's 23 million metric tons, in 2019, I think we emitted 1.8 billion metric tons to the transportation space. So it's only like 1.5%. Oh, that's not enough. Well, you know what? It's 1.5% of carbon abated that we should be doing. And I think we need to be looking at layering our solutions and our options to have compounded benefits to the market, rather than looking at, we need one initiative to fix this. Now, you need a variety of multiple steps combining to compound the benefit and maybe do it at a lower cost than a wholesale transition of something. But I think that's another challenge we run into. It's not just the myopic view that the electric vehicle is a solution. It's also this view that, well, your solution's not enough. Maybe one solution's not, but maybe 10 in a row gives you a 15% abatement. And that's significant. And I think we need to have that, keep pressing that conversation forward, that every incremental improvement is worthy exploration. If it's financially viable and it's sustainable from an economic perspective, and we can do it for a long time, then we should be pursuing it, and not be naysayed by those who say, well, it's not clean enough. But if it's better, then it should be on the table.
Yeah. And of course, closely related to that entire conversation is equitability, right? Making sure that we are not abandoning certain parts of society. Yes, we know urban areas, air quality has to be kind of a number one. And there we're talking about criteria pollutants for the most part, but making sure that standards of living. I mean, we're already hearing about the degrowth, mantras about how we better get ready for, a worsening standard of living. I don't think that's something that we should be pushing. I don't think that I think we really need to be careful of interjecting policies that could really negatively impact those that are already on the fringe, because that could be absolutely devastating. So that's my hope, is that as we interact with policymakers, they really see what the impact of these policies can be or will be, while we're making progress. Because it's going to be a huge transition. I mean, we're going through an enormous transition right now. But to not be pragmatic in this approach is you're setting people up for some huge suffering, in my opinion. All right. Boy, on that less than happy note, sorry. Sorry about that, guys. I didn't mean to be the wet blanket there, but anyway, that's it for the questions. If anybody's got any other last minute questions, drop them in there, but we're almost at the top of the hour. Again, thank you, everybody, for joining us. This session has been recorded. You will be able to find it on our Fuels Institute webpage. Please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, all that social stuff, all that fun stuff. So, and again, give us a call if you've got any questions after the fact. So, Austin, thank you very much for all your hard work on this report. And John, thank you for your words of wisdom as always.
And you get what you pay for. So take it with a grain of salt. Austin, thank you very much. Great paper,
Thank you,
great
guys.
report. Everybody, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys. Take care.